Chair, and thank you, Director Comey, for your presence here today and, of course, your great service to this country. I think you testified earlier today in your belief as to the efficacy of mandatory minimums. Is that correct?
Yes, I think I said they were a useful tool in my career as a prosecutor, especially in eliciting cooperation.
And can you just elaborate as to whether you still believe that mandatory minimums, in light of the explosion of the United States prison population, particularly relative to every other developed country in the world, is still a relevant law enforcement tool?
I think it is. Again, I'm not in a position by expertise, and I shouldn't in my job offer a view on whether it ought to be 10 years or 5 years, but I think the certainty of punishment is a useful tool in fighting crime. And in the absence of mandatory guidelines, that often comes in the form of a mandatory minimum. But that's about as far as I have the expertise and the position to go.
And is your view anchored in the fact that many prosecutors have articulated the position that in the absence of mandatory minimums, they don't have the same club by which to solicit cooperation and perhaps obtain plea bargains? Would that be part of your view here?
Yeah, in my experience, and comparing my experience with the state system, which did, again, in my experience as a prosecutor, did not have the tools to elicit cooperation that we did. But again, that's not a view on whether it ought to be this or it ought to be that. I don't have the expertise, or I'm not in a position to offer a view on that. But some certainty of punishment absent cooperation is very, very valuable in eliciting cooperation.
Now, there have been studies that have shown that in crimes that actually don't have mandatory minimums, the conviction rates at the federal level are actually higher than the conviction rates of those where mandatory minimums do exist. And so I think that's part of the reason why ideologically diverse group of individuals on both the left and the right, including the Heritage Foundation, which I believe said there's no evidence that mandatory minimums reduce crime, have questioned their continued need, at least in its current form. Now, can you comment on sort of the explosion of the United States prison population? When the war on drugs began in the early 1970s, we had less than 350,000 people who were incarcerated in America. Currently, that number is in excess of 2.3 million. As you know, we've got 5% of the world's population. 25% of the incarcerated individuals in the world are here in the United States of America. Many of us believe it creates a competitive disadvantage for us going forward, in addition to the damage that it does to the social fabric of many communities. Could you comment as to the mass incarceration phenomenon that exists in America and what, if anything, you think should be done about it from a public safety standpoint?
Sure. I struggle with the word mass incarceration because it conveys a sense that people were locked up en masse, when every case in some respect is a tragedy in my view, but everyone was individual. Everyone had a lawyer, everyone had a judge, everyone had to be proven guilty. There's no doubt a whole lot of people were locked up, and that is a big problem for our country in one respect. But here's the fact. In 2014, America was far safer than it was when I was born in 1960, and I think a big part of that change, as a result of which a whole lot of people are alive today who wouldn't be, is due to law enforcement. And so I'm of a view that, yes, we can reform our criminal justice system. It can be better in a lot of ways, but we ought to reform it with an eye towards where we used to be and how we got from there to here, because I would not want to give back to our children, our grandchildren, the America that we lived in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. That's the reason I want us to be thoughtful about it. But I believe we can be better in a whole lot of ways that we probably don't have time to talk about.
Well, I certainly think it's important for us to be thoughtful. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s in the midst of the crack cocaine epidemic. 2,000 plus homicides in the city of New York alone were down under 350, and obviously no one wants to return to that. The Pew study, though, however, I believe concluded that in all 17 states that have cut their incarceration rates, they've experienced a decline in crime over the past decade. And so it seems to me that there's room empirically, based on the data, for a real discussion as to how to get the balance correct. I gather you share that view, and I just appreciate your willingness to continue in a dialogue for us to get the benefit of your views as we move forward toward criminal justice reform.
Thank you. Happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.